All right, well, very warm welcome to all of you, and I hope that you're getting on well with the course, DMP 888, Globalization, Cooperation in the Food Trade. This is Module 4, and this is a module with one reading and then this talk, which was actually authored by, this talk was prepared by both Dr. Ackelson, the co-director for the Frontier program, and me. Dr. Ackelson, I know, is a true expert on security, which is the topic for today. He is actually the Director of Strategy in the Office of Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. And so he obviously has a lot of wisdom in this area and helped build this slide deck, and actually was responsible for most of the slide deck. So let's have some background first on kind of the problem of security and what we're looking at. Few people, I think, would deny that security ranks prominently among the problems facing humanity. People are longing for security, whether that be for themselves individually, for their families. Obviously, in the last U.S. election, the issue of national security was a major preoccupation. And then, of course, international security, which creates the need for alliances and cooperation. These are big-time problems that face humanity. National security is central because nation states, or what we call states in political science, I'll oftentimes refer to them as nation states and nation state governments, dominate many of the conditions that determine security for individuals as well as security at the international level. And this question of how states or how nation-state governments can ensure or achieve security is what we call the national security problem, and has been a major question for scholars of political science and international relations and politicians and citizens for many, many centuries. Let's talk about some definitions. First, security in the classic sense is simply the basic survival and protection of the nation state. And by extension, this means the basic survival and protection of individuals within the nation state. So if you were to look at the narrative, for instance, regarding terrorism, it's about protecting the United States, but it's also about protecting individuals. National survival and the pursuit of national interests are the minimum security objectives common to all states. Most, if not every, nation state seeks to continue to exist. They want to stay, they want to be sovereign, they want to survive. Most nation states, all nation states, are not interested in seeing their identity, their sovereignty go away. And when you think about security, it seems, even the word seems to kind of imply freedom from or even absence from some kind of threat, okay? And of course, there's many threats out there, and we'll talk about some of those today. That seems to imply that. But it also seems to imply, kind of on the positive side, maybe favorable conditions, maybe even values that make quality of life what it is in a secure society. However, Dr. Ackelson and I would argue that security is never an absolute condition. And we see this, of course, in what we've already covered in 888, the food and agriculture security dilemma, where we're seeking to balance the fact that we want to import food, but we also are mindful that those same imports could potentially represent safety, security, or health risks. And more broadly speaking, outside of food, we would say that security is the same way. Security is not an absolute condition. It's not something that you achieve and can maintain with absolute 100% success. But that doesn't mean that it's not an important policy objective, and it doesn't mean that real progress can't be made. So, many scholars, this is Dr. Akkelson's insight as a political scientist, have been dissatisfied with just the word security because it's very narrow, it's almost unmanageable. So they broadened the definition to include some additional nuance, some additional description. And we call this the sort of separation of security into 5 sectors. And I would argue there's maybe a 6th sector, but we really want you to focus on the 5. And there'll be some quiz questions about these 5. The first is military security, then political security, economic security, societal security, and environmental security. And kind of interacting with all of these is the food system. And you'll get to read a report authored by Lloyd's of London, a major global insurance company, who recently did an analysis based on a hypothetical, contrived, not real food system catastrophe that illustrates how these different sectors sort of appear in such a scenario. Let's talk about these first. Military security. Obviously, this is the armed offensive and defensive capabilities of nation-state governments, okay? And also the perception of them. So this is the world of what's the capability of North Korea? And can we defend ourselves against an intercontinental ballistic missile carrying a nuclear warhead? Is these types of questions. That's a military security sector question. Political security has to do with the legitimacy and the ongoing function of government and political operations that characterize a nation state. So in the United States, obviously, in this last election, there was a lot of discussion about political security and questions about outsiders intruding and manipulating or hacking into political organizations, systems, et cetera, and threatening the U.S. Political security. And so that's one aspect of political security. Political security also relates to, as you'll get to read, not only in this module's reading, but in future modules, the issue of when food prices rise, especially in so-called poor countries or lesser developed countries, we often see political security shocks because there may be, say, food riots, or there may be hoarding of food by those in power to the exclusion of the poor. And this affects political security. Thirdly, economic security. This is access to resources, including food, NAG, but also finance and markets. I would say a big feature in economic security right now is the world of who has access to credit, who has access to infrastructure investment, but it also has to do with who has access to the food system. The food and agricultural security dilemma that I've talked about at great length in this class is largely an economic security sector matter, right? We value the imports that come in because economically speaking, we prefer to have that choice. And even economically speaking, there's an argument to be made that food imports lower food prices, et cetera. So these are issues of economic security in that subsector. Next, fourth, societal security. This is the sustainability of traditional patterns of culture and language, might be religion and national identity. This would be everything from speaking from, say, the perspective of Canada and the United States, 2 countries that I've spent some time in. You know, and in those 2 countries, you can just kind of feel what makes Canada, Canada, and you can just kind of feel what makes the United States, the United States. And it's a combination of language or languages. It's a combination of religions, a combination of kind of the way that the expectations that citizens have of each other, of their economic, political, and social institutions. And then finally, environmental security. And this has everything to do with the world of plant and animal and kind of biosphere functioning that support human life. And this is where climate change would fall. This is also where I think you'll see in the Lloyd's report, there's some discussion about crop yields being affected by the weather, being affected by particular pests and pathogens, in particular a fungus. And environmental security is obviously important and has been given a lot of attention in recent decades. Dr. Ackelson wanted to stress, and I certainly commend to you the note here, that in the real world, these 5 sectors don't really necessarily, they're not really experienced separately. They don't operate in isolation. So we don't just see a news item about only military security or a news item only about societal security. They oftentimes interact. And I would say, and certainly as you'll get to read in the Lloyd's report, the 5 sectors kind of interact in an exceptionally complex manner when it comes to food system security. So I hope you can take the time to read the Lloyd's report. It's not a unduly lengthy report, but it's also not just a short one-pager like some of the Financial Times articles are that I've had you read. So do take the time to read that. That's the only reading assignment for this module. And here's some insights from it just to kind of get you excited to read it. In the report, just like we've been arguing in this class, the authors argue that globalization of modern food networks has introduced an unprecedented level of complexity, bringing significant benefits as well as risks. Disruptions at any one point in that system would be likely to reverberate throughout the food supply chain. And then they go on and argue this: volatile food prices and increasing political instability are likely to magnify the impacts of food production shocks, causing a cascade. There you have all the categories: economic, social or societal, political impacts across the globe. The insurance industry has a key role to play in encouraging businesses to think about their exposure to risks throughout the food supply chain and enhance global resilience to systemic food system shocks. And that's from page 7 of the report. Please take the time to read it. It's fascinating. It really does illustrate the perspective of an insurance company, which is a private company, of course, not a government. Insurance companies do interact with both government and the private sector, as well as individuals. And their whole modus operandi is evaluating risk. So I think you'll find that to be rather interesting and hopefully confirms a lot of what we've argued in this class so far. In the report, they have a hypothetical scenario. So please understand, this is not true. This has not happened, but it is relatively realistic. And it includes a number of events that are described in the report. Some of them relate to the weather. And one of the co-authors with Lloyd's in the report is actually a research unit in Britain that studies impacts of weather events. So they have expertise on that. But if you look up here in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that there's a wheat rust pathogen. It's like they actually misspelled pathogen, so we should write to Lloyd's and tell them to correct that. But they have a particular set of pests and pathogens here, and then also in Brazil and Argentina. So these yellow areas are crop epidemics, okay? This is where plant disease has occurred in the scenario, and it's exacerbated by things like weather and the food price effects of those crop yields causes political and economic instability in a number of regions, okay? And you'll get to read it in detail in the PDF, but here is, in the red circles here, shows kind of the effects of this combined catastrophe, which includes these plant disease problems. U.S. stocks go down by 5%. European stocks lose 10%. Rice production, which is a major staple for much of the world, declines by 7%. Corn or maize falls by 10%. soybean production falls by 11, and then rice prices increase by 500%. So that's a brutal, brutal reality, not reality, possible reality from this catastrophe. So that gives you a preview there of of what you'll get to see in the report. Now, Dr. Ackelson and I oftentimes talk to students in the Frontier program about some of the new challenges that we see. And one way to think about this is that a lot of the challenges we see are similar to what we have seen. So there's this theme of continuity. But there's also a theme of change. There's some things that are new, some things that are changing. Let's talk about what these might be. In the realm of national security, especially since 9/11 and the advent of transnational terrorism involving non-state actors, we now see a more complex set of actors. We see the traditional nation-state governments involved, but we also see these single individual or small size or transnational groups that would that are not traditional nation-state governments. So here's an example of the continuity, things that have kind of stayed the same. You know, we still talk about North Korea. We still talk about Iran. We still talk about military capability of the United States. We still talk about alliances. We still talk about things like NATO. Even the dominant political or international political issue right now in the United States regarding what U.S. policy should be vis-a-vis Russia and China, Iran and North Korea. This is the traditional kind of this is the continuity element of security policy. We still live in this world where we have militaries and nation-state governments, and we have to balance threats. So some of these are the world of states. According to Dr. Ackelson, we have 192 of them. I mentioned North Korea and Iran. Those are probably the two biggest national security challenges that we face as of right now. Weapons of mass destruction remain a serious concern, nuclear weapons, etc. And international trade, which we focus on a lot in this course, is also an element of continuity. Trade isn't new. You could maybe argue that trade and globalization have increased in the last 40 years. But trade has always played a role in international security issues, even early on in the history of the United States, when we would have wars break out. So for instance, the U.S. Civil War, you know, a key feature of that was the disruption of trade with Great Britain from the South. Basically the North preventing the South, for instance, from exporting their cotton to Britain. So that's continuity. Now change. This is the world of, you know, post 9/11, new threats, non-state actors, the cybersecurity issue, which has become absolutely critical. You see this cartoon here, which is a reference to avian influenza. These new biological, biosecurity, zoonotic disease threats. And I would say that the biggest change, and I think Dr. Ackelson would agree, is that we have these new non-state or transnational actors who are acting without reference to a particular country. States are no longer the sole actors. Groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups of transnational terrorists. Homeland Security, even the name of the new relatively new agency where Dr. Ackelson works, you know, founded right after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security. That's a key issue, and of course, it's not just about Islamic extremism. It's about homegrown terrorism in the United States, which we've seen. Transnational challenges include everything from the zoonotic disease threats like avian influenza, but also global climate change. The U.S. considers the climate change issue to be a major policy problem because it could potentially, and as you'll see with the weather shocks in the Lloyd's report, or the weather factors in the Lloyd's report, climate change can have a huge impact on the security of countries, and ultimately the global food system, as we've been focused on in this course. So how do we achieve security in this kind of complex realm? Well, there's means of doing that, and there's also dilemmas. And the dilemmas are just like the dilemma that I've talked about, the food and agriculture security dilemma, where we want to continue to import, yet we also need to be mindful of safety, security, and health threats that may be part of those imports. So how is national security provided? Well, principally, there's kind of two ways. There's military force, and there is diplomacy or foreign policy. And these two interact, okay? And they also are affected by domestic politics. We saw this most recently in the US presidential election. What domestic political opinions are inevitably affects who gets elected, and inevitably affects the crafting of new or ongoing national security policy. The chief component of military force is the armed forces. This is your country's capacity to go to war. There used to be different theories about the capabilities of the United States military, being able to fight two major wars on the planet at once. It's those types of questions that are central to the military force means. And you might call this hard power. Dr. Ackelson oftentimes uses the word soft power and hard power, and this will be an example of hard power. Foreign policy, on the other hand, is what we might call soft power. This is the realm of negotiation and playing on international trade-related economic interests, appealing to other countries or similarly value-minded nation states. And foreign policy is just as frequently used as military policy, and probably more frequently. And this is soft power. And as I mentioned, you can't separate domestic politics from national security. And this is one of the challenges not only for the United States, but for every one of its potential allies or adversaries, is these countries are making their national security decisions in a context that is affected by domestic politics and what their citizens believe and think and want. Well, once formulated, maybe it's a combination of military as well as so-called hard power, as well as foreign policy, so-called soft power. This can result in kind of security dilemmas. And what that relates to is that there's no clean answer to any one particular issue. And security dilemmas have been faced since the founding of the United States, and other countries have faced them. They're the kinds of decisions that I suppose our leaders don't like to have to make. They're tough judgment calls. You know, when do you go to war? When do you threaten? When do you issue sanctions on trade? When do you, which countries do you go meet with? Who do you invite to be a part of your alliance? These are all tough questions that carry risk and opportunity. And remember, the food and agriculture security dilemma is one of these. It relates to societal and economic and health and environmental security, right? And the food and ag security dilemma, restated here, looks at how we need cross-border trade flows, especially imports, because they help ensure our sense of preferences and our economic valuing of food imports or food security. But they also potentially represent a threat to our food supply and ag base. Now, if we were to apply the concept of security to the global food system, you might come to the following conclusions, which we hit on at different points in this course. First, security includes having access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet a nation-state's dietary and food preferences. Second, it seems that there is a need for both public and private sector efforts to ensure the ongoing operation of the global food system. And that's all being done to meet these dietary and food preference needs of a society, including the U.S. Third, we still need border security. We still have to have traditional enforcement going on at ports of entry, at seaports, at land border crossings, at airports. Because with respect to food, we have to regulate those agri-food imports. And we also have to make sure that we're not importing illicit or harmful substances, issues that might pose a microbiological or chemical or physical or radiological threat. But I hope that you can see that we need other, maybe non-traditional forms. And that's the area of what I call cross-border cooperation. New, maybe comparatively untraditional trade policies that incorporate these elements. And as I talked about early on in this course, these include things like bilateral regulatory coordination, things like regionalization, things like compartmentalization that are designed to address in a cross-border cooperation fashion the food and agriculture security dilemma. So I'll stop there. I hope that you enjoy the reading of the Lloyd's report, and I appreciate your attention, and thank you for those of you who participated live today by Zoom, and also thank you for those of you watching this on the recording later.